The man at the door of the Swan was soaked to the bone, his coat black with rain, his last coin held out in fingers that shook with cold, and the whole dining room turned its back on him at once, because the woman who might have served him was a thief's daughter. And a thief's daughter, they all agreed, belonged too low to carry a stranger his supper. What none of them knew, not the land agent who waved the beggar off, not the daughter who curled her lip, not even the tired woman who finally took pity and sat him by the kitchen fire, was that the muddy clerk warming his hands at her hearth owned every stone of the valley they stood in. He was the Duke of Halewood, and he was counting. Meg Wells saw the door open and the rain blow in before anyone else did, because she was the one who watched. She was always the one who watched. From the kitchen passage of the Swan she could see the whole dining room through the serving hatch, the long table where the agent's party sat over their wine and their roast, the fire that was kept high for the gentry and low for everyone else, and the front door where a stranger now stood dripping onto the flags with one hand braced against the frame as though the road had used him hard. He was perhaps 30-odd, dark, unshaven, his coat too heavy with water to read, his boots ruined. A surveyor's clerk, someone said, come ahead of the Duke's audit to measure the fields. He asked in a low and even voice whether there was a bed and a bowl of anything hot, and he held out a single coin to prove he could pay. And Silas Crane, land agent of Halewood these 11 years, did not even rise from his chair. "We are full," Crane said, which was a lie. Half the room stood empty. "And we are particular. Try the road to Kettleby. They are less particular there." The stranger made no argument. He looked once around the warm room at the faces that found their plates suddenly fascinating, and he turned to go back into the weather. That was when Arabella Crane, the agent's daughter, in a gown the green of new money, laughed her small bright laugh, and said the thing that Meg would carry like a stone in her shoe for the rest of her life. "Let the kitchen girl see to him, father, if she must do something with her hands. A thief's daughter serves from the doorway, not the table." The words landed like a slap, not on the stranger, on Meg. The room knew it, and the room enjoyed it, the way a cold room enjoys a little cruelty to warm itself. Meg felt the heat climb her throat, and she kept it from her face. She had 3 years of practice keeping it from her face, because that was the name the valley had hung on her, and the valley would not take it back. Out on the parish vestry board, not 200 yards from where she stood, a notice had yellowed in its frame for 3 winters now. It named her father, Thomas Wells, once the honest land steward of Halewood, a thief. It said he had shorted the Michaelmas rents by £40. It made no mention that Silas Crane had come into the agency that same year, and that the £40 had walked into Crane's own strongbox. The notice cared nothing for that. Her father had been dismissed in disgrace, and he had died within the year, not of any illness a doctor could name, but of shame, which kills slower and surer than fever. The cottage they had lived in went to Crane's clerk, and Meg, 26, keeper of the Swan's books in exchange for a bed in the loft and her meals from the kitchen, was barred from the dining room whenever gentry sat, because the daughter of a thief should not breathe the same air as her betters. She knew the books better than any man in the Dale. She could hold a column of figures in her head the way other people held a tune, run a year of rents up in her mind, and never drop a farthing. It had done her no good at all. Skill, she had learned, was a candle the valley forbade her to light, so she held her tongue and kept her eyes dry. She wiped her hands on her apron, took up the heel of the loaf that was meant to be her own supper, and went out the kitchen door into the yard to find the stranger before he reached the road. He was already at the gate, head down in the rain. "Sir," she said. He stopped and turned. In the lantern light his eyes were very steady, dark and quiet, the eyes of a man who was used to being looked at and had decided long ago not to mind it. "There is a fire in the kitchen," Meg said. "It is not the gentry's fire, but it is warm, and there is supper, such as it is. Come in out of the wet." He looked at the coin, still in his hand. "I can pay." "Sit by the fire," Meg said. "Supper is not a thing a man should have to beg for." Something moved across his face then. Not surprise exactly. More like a man hearing a sentence he had waited a long time to hear and could scarcely believe. He closed his fingers over the coin and followed her in. She sat him on the settle by the kitchen hearth, the long old bench with the worn cushion that had stood beside that fire, longer than she had been alive. She built the fire up with her own ration of wood. She set before him the heel of bread that was her supper, and the bowl of barley broth that was her supper, and a wedge of hard cheese, and she let him think it was the inn's, because naming it hers would have made it a debt. She wanted him fed, not beholden. He ate the way a hungry man eats who is trying not to show it. When he was halfway down the bowl, he set down the spoon and held out the coin again. "For the food," he said. "No," Meg said. "You will be the poorer for it. I have been poorer for less honest reasons." She took the kettle off the hook and poured him something hot to drink. "Keep your coin. You will want it on the Kettleby Road." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put the coin away, and this time he kept it out of sight. His name, he said, was Grey. Mr. Grey. He was a surveyor's clerk, come up from the south to take the field measurements ahead of the great Michaelmas audit, when the new Duke, home at last from 11 years abroad, would have all the rents and acres of Halewood laid open before him. He spoke of the Duke the way a servant speaks of a master he has never met, which was to say carefully, and Meg, half listening as she scoured a pot, noticed something that she filed away without quite meaning to. He never asked what the Duke was like. Every stranger asked. The whole Dale had asked of nothing else for a month. Was the new Duke proud? Was he handsome? Was he hard? Would he raise the rents or lower them? Would he marry? It was the only question worth asking in a valley that had gone over a decade without sight of its lord. But Mr. Grey, who worked for the man, who was nearer to him than any of them, asked nothing, as though he already knew the answer, as though the question were one he could only put to a looking-glass. She made nothing of it. Not that night. She only filed it, the way she filed every figure that refused to add up. He stayed 3 nights at the Swan, paying for his bed in honest coin, eating in the kitchen by choice, though Josiah Pitt, the landlord, would have grudgingly let a paying clerk into the dining room when the Cranes were away. He went out in the mornings with a clerk's satchel and a measuring chain, and came back at dusk with a mud to the knee, and every evening he came to the kitchen fire as though it were the only fire in the world. And every evening Meg watched him, and the small wrong figures added up. His boots, once they dried, were too well stitched for a clerk's wage, made for his own foot, not bought off a peg. His fingers carried a clerk's ink, true, but his hand moved slowly, the way a man writes who has always had time and never had a master at his shoulder. And once, when she left her own private sheet of figures on the table by accident, the sheet she should never have left anywhere, he picked it up before she could snatch it back, and he read it. He read it the wrong way. A stranger reading a column of rent figures reads it like a man learning something. Mr. Grey read it like a man checking something he already suspected. His eyes went down the discrepancies. Crane's posted rent for the Hartley holding set against what old Hartley had told her he actually paid. The difference pocketed, the same trick repeated down the parish. And his jaw tightened, and instead of asking, "What is this?" the way a clerk would, he said very quietly, "How long have you been keeping this?" 2 years, Meg said, and took the sheet back, and her heart was hammering because she had told no living soul. "It is nothing. It is arithmetic." "It is not nothing," Mr. Grey said. "Why do you keep it?" She should have lied. The truth came out of her before she chose it. "My father kept true books," she said. "So do I." He was quiet a long moment. Then he nodded, once, as though she had handed him something he meant to keep, and he said nothing more about it. But after that, the evenings by the fire changed. They had stopped being transactions, a clerk and a kitchen woman trading the price of broth. They became conversations, slow and careful, the kind of conversation 2 people have when each has decided the other is worth the risk of an honest word. She kept her father back at first, and he let her. He had a way of not asking that was somehow gentler than any question, a way of leaving a door open and waiting to see whether she would walk through it. After the 4th evening she walked through it. She told him about Thomas Wells, who had kept the rent rolls of Halewood for 19 years and never lost a farthing, who had begun to notice the last year of his life that the figures Silas Crane carried up to the old Duke abroad ran short of the figures the tenants paid. She told him how her father had said he meant to write to the Duke directly, over Crane's head, and how, 3 weeks later, the £40 shortfall had appeared in the books, in her father's own hand, or in a hand so like it that the parish failed to tell the difference, and how the notice had gone up on the vestry board, and how her father had stopped going to church to spare himself the walk past his own name with the word thief beside it. Mr. Grey listened to all of it without moving. When she finished, the fire had burned low, and she realised she had been talking for the better part of an hour, and that he had let her finish without once reaching to comfort her, which was the only thing that made it bearable. "My father signed whatever was carried to him," Mr. Grey said at last. It was no answer to her story. It was something torn out of his own. He trusted the men who brought him paper because trusting them was easier than reading. He died believing the lies in his own ledgers, hated by honest men for rents he never ordered, and loved by the liars who ordered them in his name. He looked into the fire. I will not inherit that. Whatever else I do, I will not sign what I have not read. Meg missed then how strange a thing that was for a surveyor's clerk to say. She understood only that she had told the truth to a man for the first time in 3 years, and that he had answered it with a truth of his own, and that her heart, which she had kept under lock and ledger since her father died, had done something it had no business doing. Halewood was a small world, and it had its tests. The first came on market day, when the Dowager Duchess of Halewood, who lived quiet at the Dower House and was reckoned half a recluse, came down to the market square in her old black carriage, and sent her woman to the Swan to ask whether the girl who kept the books might attend her ladyship over the matter of the inn's market day account. Josiah Pitt went white. The Dowager Duchess had no business within accounts. But one did not refuse the Dowager, so Meg wiped her hands and went out to the carriage, and the old woman looked at her down a long nose, with eyes that missed nothing. She asked 3 questions. She asked what the Swan had cleared on the wool sale the previous Michaelmas, and Meg told her, to the shilling. She asked what the difference was between the posted toll on the Kettleby Road and the toll the carriers swore they had paid, and Meg told her that too because she had worked it out long ago. And she asked, last, with her head tilted like a bird's, what a woman who could hold such figures in her head was doing keeping the books of a coaching inn for her bed and board. I am a thief's daughter, your grace, Meg said evenly. There is no other place for a thief's daughter to keep books. The Dowager regarded her for a long moment. The figures do not flatter you, girl, she said, and that is the finest thing I have heard this year. She rapped the carriage roof with her stick. Drive on. That was all. But Meg felt, watching the black carriage rattle away, that she had passed through some gate she had walked through unawares, and that the old woman's eyes, before she left, had moved once across the market square to where Mr. Grey stood by the wool stage with his satchel, and had rested on him a beat too long, and had said nothing. The Dowager knew, Meg thought later. Whatever there was to know, the Dowager knew it, and held her peace. The second test was crueler, and it was Crane's doing. The wool factor from Leeds came up to the Dale, as he came every autumn to buy the clip and settle the season's accounts, and it was a great day in the square. The whole valley's year of work weighed and priced in an afternoon. Crane stood at the factor's table as the Duke's agent, since the Duke himself had yet to come, and Crane meant the day to show the Dale who held the power in it. The trouble was that Crane was hopeless at sums. He always had been. He had risen by other arts, and when the factor's tally and the tenants' tallies refused to agree, when half the Dale stood about the table growing ugly, certain they were being cheated of a season's wool, Crane's face went the colour of tallow, because a riot in the square on the eve of the Duke's audit was the one thing he could least afford. It was Josiah Pitt, gruff and frightened, who muttered it. Wells's girl can do it. She can do it in her head. Crane would sooner have eaten the ledger, but the factor, a practical man, said let her, and the crowd took it up, and so Meg Wells, thief's daughter, was called to the gentry's table in the open square, with the whole valley watching. She took her time. She gathered the factor's book and the tenants' tallies, and she stood very straight in her plain dress among the broadcloth, and she read the columns the way her father had taught her, top to bottom, and she found the error inside 2 minutes. It was no theft this time, only carelessness. The factor's clerk had entered the long wool weight against the short wool price for a third of the holdings, and the short clip against the long. She showed it plainly, holding the book so the factor could see, and she carried the correction down through every affected line, naming each holding and its true sum, and when she finished there was a sum at the bottom that the tenants and the factor could both agree was honest. The square was silent. Then old Hartley, who had farmed the Dale 60 years, said, "That's right, that's the true figure, the lass has it." And the crowd let out its breath all at once, and somebody cheered, and the cheer was for her. Meg looked up from the book, and across the square, leaning against the wool stage with his arms folded and his satchel at his feet, Mr. Grey was watching her with an expression she would never afterward be able to describe and never forget. Not surprise, not even pride quite. Something more like a man watching a thing he had bet his whole hand on come good before his eyes. Silas Crane watched her with nothing of the kind. He took the book back the moment the factor was done with it, and he smiled, the thin smile of a man storing up a debt. And when the crowd had thinned, he came to Meg where she stood and said low, so only she could hear, "You are very clever, Wells's girl. Your father was very clever too. See where it got him." That night, the slander notice on the vestry board, which had faded almost to nothing in 3 winters, was fresh inked. Someone had gone over every letter of it by lamplight, made the word thief black and bold again, and added a line at the bottom in a clerk's careful hand. "The thief's blood runs true." The whole valley walked past it on the way to church the next morning. Meg walked past it too. She kept walking. She would not give them that, but she felt the letters on the back of her neck like a brand, and for the first time in a long time the inner strength she had hoarded so carefully felt thin as paper. That was the start of the dark days. Crane moved against her on every front at once, the way a man moves who has been frightened and has decided that the cure for fear is cruelty. He called in her father's debt, the £40, with 3 years' interest, a sum no kitchen woman could ever pay, and he had the demand served on her at the Swan in front of the morning's customers, so the whole room would know that the thief's daughter was a debtor too. He went to Josiah Pitt and reminded him, in that soft voice, that the Swan's licence to keep a coaching house came up for renewal at Michaelmas, and that the renewal lay in the gift of the estate, which was to say in Crane's gift, and that an innkeeper who harboured a debtor and a thief's get under his roof might find his licence harder to come by than he expected. And he spread it through 3 parishes, Arabella helping with a will, that the Swan was a den of cheats, that the books the girl kept were doctored, that no honest traveller should stop there. Josiah Pitt was ordered to turn Meg out. He did not. He stood in the kitchen with the order in his hand and his jaw working, owing his whole living to Crane's goodwill, and he said, gruffly, that he was an old man, and forgetful, and that he might just forget to do it, and that she was to keep out of the dining room and out of sight, and not make it harder than it was. It cost him. She knew what it cost him. He lost custom that week, the timid kind that believed gossip, and he never once said a word about it to her, which was his way of saying everything. Prue, the scullery girl, 14 and frightened, cried in the pantry and asked Meg if they were all to be put on the road, and Meg held her and told her no, with no way to know whether it was true, and Mr. Grey was gone. He had ridden out 4 days before on what he called the estate's business, south toward the post road, and had stayed away, and as the slander thickened and the demand for £40 sat on the kitchen table like a coiled thing, Meg found that the worst of it was neither the debt nor the licence nor the notice. The worst of it was that she had let herself believe, for a handful of evenings by a fire, that a quiet, honest man saw her clearly and thought her worth seeing, and that the moment the ground turned soft he had ridden away like every other soul who had ever found her father's name inconvenient. She sat by the kitchen fire alone on the night before Michaelmas Eve, the demand for £40 in her hand, and she let herself think the thought she had kept out for 3 years. Perhaps a thief's daughter is all the valley has room for. Perhaps her father had been a fool to keep true books in a place that punished true books. Perhaps she was a fool to go on keeping them. Perhaps the kindest thing she could do for herself was to burn her 2 years of discrepancy sheets in the grate, pay nothing, beg nothing, and let the valley have the version of her it wanted, because fighting had cost her father his life, and had cost her everything but her stubbornness, and stubbornness paid no part of £40. She held the sheets toward the fire, and then she stayed her hand. She put them down instead, and she sat for a long while looking at the old settle across the hearth, the long bench with the worn cushion that her father had loved to sit on in the months before he died, when he came down to the Swan of an evening, to be anywhere but the cottage with the notice hanging over it. He had sat there the week before he died, she remembered suddenly, with a needle and stout thread, mending the cushion, he had said, though she had seen nothing wrong with it. He had been bad at sewing. The seam he made had been crooked and lumpy, and she had teased him for it. Meg crossed the kitchen and turned the cushion over. The seam was still there, crooked and lumpy, her father's clumsy stitches 3 years old. She had passed it 1,000 times. She had sat on it. She had never thought to open it, because opening it meant admitting that the books her father swore by were buried for good and the asking would never come. She got the kitchen scissors and she cut the thread. Inside the cushion, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, sewn into the settle by the Swan's own fire the week before her father died, was a ledger, his ledger, The duplicate rent roll of Halewood that Thomas Wells had kept in secret the last year of his life. Every true rent set against every false one Crane carried up to the Duke. Every forged receipt, every shilling skimmed in her father's honest hand. The original true account, against which Crane's whole 11 years could be measured and found wanting. Meg sat on the floor of the kitchen with the ledger in her lap and wept for the first time in 3 years. Not from grief, but from something fiercer. Her father had not buried his honesty. He had hidden it where his daughter, who kept books by the same fire, would one day find it. He had trusted her to be the one who asked. She was reading it by candle when the knock came at the door, near midnight. It was not Crane. It was a stranger in a good travelling coat, grey with road dust, an older man with a sharp, tired face and a leather case under his arm, who introduced himself as Mr. Dunmore, solicitor, lately of London, and asked with grave courtesy whether he had the honour of addressing Miss Margaret Wells. No one had called her Miss Wells in 3 years. "I have ridden hard to be here before the morning," Mr. Dunmore said, on the instruction of my client, who was most particular that certain matters be in order before the Michaelmas audit. He glanced at the ledger open in her hands, and something flickered in his tired eyes. Satisfaction or relief. "I see you have found it. He thought you might by now." He hoped so. "Who is your client?" Meg said. "You will have your answer in the morning, Miss Wells, in the great hall with the rest of the valley." Mr. Dunmore set his case on the table and drew out a single folded paper. "I am permitted to tell you only this much tonight, so that you may sleep. The Swan's mortgage was bought 3 weeks ago, quietly, through a third party, and is now held by my client. Mr. Crane's threat to break Mr. Pitt's licence died the day that deed was signed. He simply does not yet know it. And the demand against your father's estate," he looked at the coiled paper on the table, "is founded on an entry my client has reason to believe was forged. I would not pay it if I were you. I would bring that ledger to the Great Hall in the morning, and I would say nothing to anyone until you are asked." Meg stared at him. "Why? Why would anyone do this for the daughter of a thief?" Mr. Dunmore almost smiled. "Because, Miss Wells, my client does not believe your father was a thief, and because some weeks ago a man came to a kitchen fire wet through and friendless, and a woman gave him her own supper and would not take his last coin." He took up his case. "He has not forgotten it. He is a man who forgets nothing. Good night, and bring the ledger." He was gone into the dark before she could find a word. Meg sat alone by the fire with her father's true books in her lap, and her heart doing the thing again that it had no business doing, and very slowly, like a sum coming right, she began to understand. The great hall of Halewood Court had not seen such a crowd in 11 years. It was the morning of Michaelmas, the one day in the year when every book in the valley lay open on a single table, when every tenant came to render his rent and every account was settled before the Lord, except that for 11 years there had been no Lord, only Silas Crane standing at the head of the long table with the Duke's seal in his keeping and the Duke's power in his hand. He stood there now in his best black coat, his forged Michaelmas book before him bound in new leather, the cooked accounts that he meant to lay before the returning Duke, signed at the foot with a steward's mark that Thomas Wells had never in his life used. Arabella sat near the front in cloth of silver, radiant, certain, for it was all but settled, was it not? The county had heard it from her own lips, that the new Duke's hand and hers were as good as joined. The gentry sat on chairs, the tenants stood. The Dowager Duchess of Halewood sat apart in her widow's black, watching everything from under her lashes, and Mr. Abney, the grey old steward who had served 3 Dukes of Halewood and stood behind the high seat for 50 years, waited by the empty chair at the head of the hall for a master none of them had seen. Meg came in at the back, in her plain dress, with her father's ledger wrapped in its oilcloth held against her like a child. Crane saw her come, and his face did something ugly. "This is an audit of the Duke's tenants," Crane said, his voice carrying down the hall. "Not a refuge for debtors. Who let the Wells creature in? She owes the estate £40, and a deal of shame besides." He looked about for his audience and found it. "Put her out. A thief's daughter serves from the doorway, not the table." There it was again. The same words, in the same mouth, before a far greater crowd. They landed on Meg as they always had. But this time she kept her eyes up. This time she held the ledger tighter, and she stood her ground at the back of the hall, and she said in a clear voice that surprised her, "I will leave when the books are read, Mr. Crane, not before. You will leave when I—" "She will stay." The voice came from the side of the hall, from the door to the steward's room, and it was quiet, and it stopped Silas Crane's mouth more surely than a shout. A man stepped through into the light. He was dressed now as no surveyor's clerk had ever dressed, in dark good cloth cut close without a speck of mud, his face shaved and his bearing easy and certain. But it was the same face. It was the same dark, steady eyes that had watched her across the wool stage and the kitchen fire. It was Mr. Gray. Meg's breath went out of her all at once. No one in the hall knew him. The hall saw a well-dressed stranger and murmured. Arabella half rose, her gaze flicking over the cut of his coat, calculating, hopeful, not yet daring. Crane's tallow face was caught between fury and the first crawl of fear, because there was something in the way the man walked the length of his own hall that no clerk had any right to. He walked to the head of the table. He stood beside the empty chair. He looked at the forged book, bound in new leather, and left it untouched. And old Abney, the grey steward who had served 3 dukes and was too old to be fooled by a coat or a beard or 11 years, took one look at the man's face in the morning light, and his knees did what knees do that have waited 50 years for their master to come home. He bowed, low and shaking and certain. "Your Grace," said Abney. The word went through the hall like a stone through a window. The man at the head of the table let it land. He looked down the length of the hall, at the gentry on their chairs and the tenants on their feet, and the agent gone grey at the head of the table, and the woman at the very back with a ledger held against her heart, and he said it plainly. The plainest sentence in all that crowded morning, with no apology and no flourish, only the truth laid down like a card. "My name is Gabriel Stroud. I am the Duke of Halewood." The room repriced him one face at a time. Meg watched it happen, the understanding moving across the hall in a wave, chairs scraping, a lady's fan dropping, a teacup halted halfway to a mouth and held there forgotten. She watched Arabella Crane's lovely face perform the most terrible sum of all. The muddy clerk her father had turned from the door, the beggar she had laughed at, the man she had said was fit only for the kitchen girl to feed from the doorway, was the Duke. Was the very Duke whose hand she had told 3 parishes was as good as hers. The colour left her by degrees, the way the tide leaves a flat. "I have been 11 years abroad," the Duke said, into the silence. "My father died believing this valley was content and its rents fairly gathered. He believed it because the man who carried him the books told him so, and my father signed whatever was carried to him." His eyes went to Crane. "I swore, when I came home, that I would not be my father, that I would see the valley with my own eyes before any man could arrange the view for me. So I came home with no face that any of you would know, and I walked my own land as a clerk, and I asked about rents all day long, and I listened." He paused. "I learned a great deal in a kitchen, Mr. Crane, more than I learned in this hall." Crane found his voice, and it was the voice of a man scrambling up a bank as it slides. "Your Grace, what a surveyor's clerk hears in a kitchen. Gossip, malice, the spite of a debtor. The girl owes the estate £40. She would say anything." "The girl," said the Duke, "has said nothing to me at all this morning. I have not spoken to her since I came home. Everything I am about to lay before this hall I knew before I left that kitchen." He looked toward the back of the hall. "But she has brought something with her. Miss Wells, come to the table." The whole hall turned to look at her. 3 years of being looked at as a thing to despise, and now they looked at her as Gabriel Stroud said her name, and the looking was different, and she found that her legs would carry her after all. She walked the length of the great hall of Halewood, past the gentry, past Arabella's stricken face, past Crane, and she set her father's ledger on the table beside Crane's book of lies, oilcloth and new leather side by side. "Mr. Crane has brought the estate's Michaelmas book," the Duke said. "Mr. Abney, be so good as to read me the rent set against the Hartley holding, as Mr. Crane has it written." Abney read it. A figure. "Miss Wells, the rent the Hartley holding truly paid, as your father set it down." Meg opened her father's ledger to the page she had read 100 times by candlelight, and she read the true figure, lower by a third, and old Hartley in the crowd said hoarsely, "Aye, that's what I paid, that's what I always paid," and a mutter ran through the standing tenants like wind through barley. They went down the book that way, the Duke calling the holdings, Abney reading Crane's figure, Meg reading her father's, the tenants confirming one after another with a growing, dangerous murmur, and the £40 and the £400 and the count of 11 years of skimming rose in the hall like water rising in a low room, until Silas Crane stood in it to the neck. "This is forgery," Crane said. "These books, the Wells books, are the forgery, doctored by a thief's daughter to ruin an honest agent. The signature, Mr. Crane." The Duke's voice stayed low. It only went very level, and the hall went quiet to hear it. "On your Michaelmas book, the steward's mark at the foot. Mr. Abney has stood behind 3 stewards of Halewood. Mr. Abney, did Thomas Wells ever in his life make that mark?" "Never, Your Grace," said Abney. "Thomas Wells signed his full name always, all 19 years. He used to say a mark was for men who'd something to hide. That mark there," the old steward's finger trembled at the forged book, "is the mark Mr. Crane's own clerk uses. I have seen it on 100 of Mr. Crane's papers." Mr. Dunmore rose then from his seat among the gentry, the leather case in his hand, and laid before the Duke the forged demand for £40, and beside it 3 of Crane's genuine papers bearing the same false mark, and the deed of the Swan's mortgage, and the matter was, as a matter of law, finished. Crane saw it finish. Meg watched him see it. The Duke looked at the 2 books on the table a long moment. Then he picked up Crane's Book of Lies, the cooked Michaelmas account that an agent had brought for his lord to sign without reading, as his father would have signed it, and he set it down again unsigned, and pushed it away from him across the table. "My father signed what was carried to him," Gabriel Stroud said. "I will not." Instead, he drew toward him a fresh sheet that Dunmore had ready, and he took a pen, and before the assembled tenantry, before he read a single charge against Silas Crane, before he spent 1 ounce of his power on his own grievance, he spent it first on a dead man's name. He wrote, and Abney read it aloud as he wrote, a retraction to be entered that very day in the parish record and carved fresh upon the vestry board, that Thomas Wells, late steward of Halewood, charged 3 years gone with theft, was, and had always been a true steward, falsely charged, his name cleared wholly, the lie struck from the record forever. The Duke signed it, his own name, in full, no mark, the way her father always had. Meg heard the words "a true steward falsely charged," and 3 years of held breath went out of her, and she stayed dry-eyed, because she had wept the night before and there was none left. But she put her hand flat on her father's ledger, as though she could pass the news down through the leather to wherever he was. Then, and only then, the Duke turned to the agent. "Silas Crane, for 11 years you have skimmed the rents of this estate, forged its books, and laid the theft at the door of the one honest man who caught you. You buried him in his own grave and his daughter in his shame." He let it sit. "You came to the Swan and turned a stranger from the door because he looked too poor to matter. You should have a care, Mr. Crane, who you turn from a door. You never know who is standing in the rain." Arabella made a small broken sound. Crane's face had gone past tallow to the grey of ash. "There will be charges and a magistrate, and the law will have its turn with you," the Duke said. "But the valley will have its turn first, since it was the valley you robbed." He glanced at the doorway of the great hall, where the morning light came in, where the servants stood, where the low people stood who had been kept from the table all their lives, and he said the thing that paid the whole debt, the yardstick turned back at last upon the man who had cut it. "You may answer from the doorway, Mr. Crane. The table is for honest books." It was so quiet in the hall that Meg heard the fire crack in the great hearth. Then somewhere among the tenants a man began to laugh, low, and another took it up. And it was no cruel laughter, quite. It was the laughter of people who had been afraid of a man for 11 years, and had just been told by the only authority that could tell them that they need not be afraid any longer. Silas Crane walked down the length of the hall he had ruled, alone, past the tenants he had robbed, to the doorway he had banished better people to, and the laughter followed him out into the Michaelmas morning, and his daughter, after a frozen moment in her cloth of silver, gathered her skirts and fled after him with her face in her hands. The Dowager Duchess of Halewood, who had said nothing all the while, leaned to her woman and remarked in a carrying voice that she had known the boy the moment he stepped through the door, and had wondered how long it would take the rest of them, and that the kitchen girl had a better head for figures than every gentleman in the hall put together, which she had said all along. The hall began, at last, to breathe. The audit went on, true now, holding by holding, and the Duke came down the length of the table to where Meg stood with her father's ledger under her hand, and for the first time since the night he ate her supper, The two of them were as near to alone as a crowded hall would allow. "You rode away," Meg said. It was the last thing she had meant to say. It came out anyway. "Before Michaelmas, when Crane was closing in. You rode away and left me to it." "I rode to London," Gabriel said quietly, "to buy a mortgage and a magistrate's writ and to set my solicitor on the road, so that when I stood up in this hall I should have more to offer you than my word." He looked at her steadily. "I could not rescue you, Meg. Not on a stage, not before the time. If I had stepped in to save the thief's daughter, the valley would have said you rose by my favour, and you would have been my creature ever after, and they would have been right to say it. You had to stand alone, and be seen to stand alone, so that no man living could ever say your name was anything but your own." He paused. "It was the hardest thing I have done, standing in the back of a room watching them say that word to you, and keeping still. I will not pretend it was not." Meg looked at him. The muddy clerk who was a duke, the man who had come to her fire wet through and let her feed him, and asked nothing, and seen everything. "You never asked what the duke was like," she said. A corner of his mouth moved. "No," he said. "I could not think of a way to answer it honestly." She laughed then, despite the hall, despite everything, a startled, wet laugh, and he smiled at her, the dry, slow smile she would come to know, and the gentry pretended very hard not to watch, and the dowager watched openly. He made no proposal that day. There was a dark week between the audit and the rest, when the truth of the deception sat between them and had to be reckoned with, for he had eaten at her table under a false name, and let her open her whole guarded heart to a man who had worn a false name, and that was a thing that had to cost something before it could be forgiven, and Meg made it cost something, because she was nobody's creature, and refused to be made a fool of even by a duke. She told him so plainly by the kitchen fire of the Swan, the week after Michaelmas. He offered no long defence. He never did. He said 3 things only: that the disguise had been against Crane, and never against her, that the moment he heard her say, "My father kept true books, so do I," he had stopped being able to think of her as anyone's daughter but her own, and that he had told her one entirely true thing in that kitchen, the truest thing he knew, which was that he would not sign what he had not read, and that he had read her, and meant to sign. Meg let him sit with the silence a while, because he had let her sit with hers. Then she forgave him, not all at once, but by the fire, in her own time, on her own terms. The wedding came at the turn of the year, and it was small. It was in the parish church, the same church whose vestry board had carried her father's shame for 3 winters, and now carried his vindication carved fresh in oak, and the gentry who had expected to fill the front pews found them filled instead with tenants, with old Hartley, and with Josiah Pitt scrubbed and miserable in a collar, and with Prue weeping happily into a borrowed handkerchief, and with the whole Dale that had once walked past Meg Wells with their eyes turned away, and now could not look at her enough. The Dowager Duchess of Halewood gave the bride away, on the grounds, she said, that nobody else in the family was fit to, and that she had picked the girl herself, more or less, from a carriage window over the matter of an inn account. That is the most of the story. But there is a year that comes after, and it is worth the telling, because the years that come after are where you learn whether a reversal held. 1 year later, at Michaelmas, Silas Crane kept his neck. The Duke wanted no hanging, only a reckoning, which is a colder and a more useful thing. Crane was put under a bond of restitution, 5 years of every shilling he earned garnished and paid out to the tenants he had skimmed, holding by holding the very list Thomas Wells had kept in his hidden ledger, and the work appointed him, by the Duke's own dry instruction, was to sit in the estate office under old Abney's eye, and copy the true rent rolls of Halewood, fair and exact, in his own forging hand, so that the man who had got rich making false books spent his days making true ones, and was paid nothing for it but his keep and the long memory of the hall. Meg thought that was poetic, and said so, and Gabriel said he had learned the word poetic from a woman who could do sums, and that he found it suited the books. Arabella Crane did not marry a duke, nor a lord, nor anyone at all. Her all but settled match became the favourite cautionary joke of 3 parishes, told at every wool sale. The lady who told the county her hand was as good as joined to a duke she had laughed out of an inn-door in the rain, and she could ill bear the telling of it, and went away at last to an aunt in Carlisle, where the joke had yet to travel, though it travelled after her in time, as such things do. Prue was taught her letters by Meg, who said no girl who could weep at a doorway for a stranger should go through life unable to read, and Prue learned them fast and well, and was named under the housekeeper at Halewood Court, named in the new household by her own name, which she had never expected to see written anywhere but a parish register of the poor. Josiah Pitt's Swan, free of its mortgage, throve as never before, for it became known up and down the post road as the inn where the new Duchess had once kept the books, and travellers came miles out of their way to take supper in a dining room they were now, all of them, allowed to enter, and on the vestry board of the parish church, where a yellowed lie had hung 3 winters, there was carved instead, deep in good oak that would outlast the men who read it, Thomas Wells, true steward of Halewood. They called her the thief's daughter no longer. The valley, which is quick to name and slow to forget, found her a new name within the year, and it stuck because it was earned. They called her the Duke's right hand, for she was no ornament in the great hall. She became its memory and its conscience, the keeper of its true books, the one the tenants came to when a figure looked wrong, the one the Duke himself laid every account before, because he had sworn he would never again sign what he had not read. And the surest way to read a thing was to read it beside Meg. There was a letter, that second Michaelmas, that came up from a neighbouring estate beyond the moor, sealed and grave, from a lord who had heard, for these things travel, of the Duchess of Halewood, who read books the way agents fear, and who begged, with a great deal of careful courtesy that thinly veiled the fear under it, that she might be prevailed upon to look at his own rent-rolls, which he had lately begun, he wrote, to suspect. The letter lay on the kitchen table of the Swan, beside a new ledger, bound and unopened, that had come with it. Meg had yet to open the ledger. She would, in the morning. There would always, she was learning, be another ledger, for that was the other thing about the years that came after. Every Michaelmas, on the night of the audit, when the great hall was swept and the tenants gone home content and the true books locked away, the Duke and Duchess of Halewood kept away from the great hall. They walked down to the Swan, the 2 of them, and went in at the kitchen door, and sat on the old settle by the kitchen fire, the very settle where a duplicate ledger had once slept 3 years inside a crooked seam, and Josiah Pitt, grumbling that it was no fit place for a duke and serving them anyway because he would hear of nothing else, brought them barley broth and bread and a wedge of hard cheese, the supper of the poor, the supper she had once given a wet stranger and would not take his coin for, and the Duke paid for it. He insisted on paying for it every year with the same coin, the single coin he had held out to her in the rain that first night, the last coin of a man pretending to be poor, which she had refused. She had kept it. She had it still. She had had a hole drilled through it and worn it on her watch chain, where it had grown thin and bright with handling, and every Michaelmas he took it from the chain at her breast with his own fingers, and set it on the table to pay for their supper, and every year she swept it up and put it back on the chain, because the seat by that fire was no thing to be bought, and they both knew it, and the buying was only a way of saying so. The seat by the fire is yours, he had told her, the first Michaelmas they did it, for life. She had asked him, that first year, sitting in the firelight with the worn coin warm in her hand, why a duke should care so much for a kitchen and a bench and a bowl of poor man's broth, when he had a hall the length of the parish, and a table that could seat 100, and Gabriel Stroud, who spoke in plain words and spent his power once and well and kept his largest truths for the smallest rooms, had looked at the fire, and then at her, and given her the only answer he had, which was the answer she had taught him without ever meaning to, on a wet night when she had nothing to give a stranger but her own supper and gave it anyway. Rank may fill a hall, but kindness keeps the fire.